Mr. Speaker, at a time when the United Kingdom is divided and public trust in our democracy is shaken, this Queen's speech was also an opportunity to rebuild the foundations of our democracy. Instead, what does it do? The Electoral Integrity Bill would make it harder for people to vote. It tramples on civil liberties and it discriminates. The Prime Minister must know that by introducing compulsory voter ID, he will suppress turnout. It will disproportionately impact ethnic minorities and it will weaken our democracy. Labour will have no part in that.
Voter suppression. You'll have heard that term being spat out by socialists across the country, flooding social media, your television screens and your newspapers with ranting objections to the upcoming introduction of voter ID in all future local and general elections. But why are they objecting so fiercely, and are their concerns based in fact? Currently, in this country and in others, you need ID to drive, to register at a library, to attend a momentum meeting, to watch certain movies, to pick up a parcel, to buy a packet of fags, even to purchase a can of Red Bull. So then why is it that Western democratic countries don't ask for ID in the same way to vote? Why aren't voters across the world required to simply show a passport, a driving licence, or another form of photographic ID to prove that the vote they're about to cast really does belong to them? Well, in actual fact, they do. Right now, voter ID is a legal requirement in numerous countries across the planet. Argentina, Brazil, Canada, France, Germany, Iceland, Hungary, Greece, India, Israel, Italy, Mexico, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, Switzerland, Northern Ireland all have laws that require voters to show ID to vote in their elections. It's proven to work. It's proven to protect democracy. Yet this week, already we're seeing cries and yells flooding through Twitter, emanating from the same people like the Europhile serial dribbler Anthony Grayling, from irrelevant attention addict Femi, and from various uneducated journalists and Corbyn-cuddling MPs like David Lammy. What the Labour MP fails to mention, however, is that in 2002, he himself voted for the introduction of voter ID in Northern Ireland. Voters in Northern Ireland have in fact been required to produce ID at the polling station since 1985. But in 2002, Prime Minister Tony Blair and the Labour Party voted to update the law to ensure that voter IDs had to contain a photograph, with free electoral IDs being given to anyone who didn't own a driving licence or passport. Figures from 2017 and 2019 show that voter ID didn't have any impact on turnout, with Northern Ireland voters heading to the polls and showing their ID no differently than previous elections, and on par with England, Scotland and Wales. David Lammy also conveniently ignores the fact that in the past 6 months alone, numerous Labour politicians and activists were either investigated, charged or convicted of vote fraud, including a Labour councillor who was charged along with 4 of his campaigners. He also conveniently fails to mention the 2 Labour branches, which are still under police investigation for vote fraud. Or the Labour councillor who was sent to prison for vote fraud just earlier this year. In the 2019 general election, VoteWatch was swamped with reports from angry and confused members of the public who had turned up to vote at their local polling station only to find that their votes had been stolen via voter impersonation and that they had thus been recorded as having already voted, so were not allowed to vote. We received and reported to the police voter impersonation in Slough, in Newcastle and in various constituencies across the country, including the following woman who went to vote only to find that her vote too had already been cast, shockingly by a man who had somehow managed to go into the polling station, give her name and address and was then given her ballot paper. This, without doubt, is what real voter suppression looks like. Another important problem that no one is talking about are the many people illegally on the electoral register. Recently, a report compiled by the Electoral Commission found that between 8.3 and 9.4 million voters were not correctly registered, thus were illegally on the register. How many of these people are illegally voting in our elections? How many have simply made a mistake in their registration, and how many have registered fraudulently on purpose? The answer is that we simply don't know, and that should worry us immensely. There could be hundreds of thousands, even millions of votes illegally being cast in our elections, undermining your vote and placing British democracy at grave risk. During this election, a former MP revealed that in a sample of more than 80 immigration cases in his old constituency, more than 15% were illegally on the electoral register. And that was just a sample, from thousands of such immigration cases in one constituency alone. There are 650 constituencies across the UK. How many immigrants in the UK are illegally registered and thus illegally voting in local and general elections? How many non-immigrants are illegally voting? Once again, the worrying answer is that we simply do not know. So how do we tackle it? How can we stop voter impersonation, postal vote fraud, intimidation, and the many other forms of electoral fraud that continue to poison our politics? Well, voter ID is just the first step, but it's still a very important step to take. And despite the sudden cries of outrage from the left and the blatant campaign by our mainstream media to oppose the reforms laid out by the Conservatives, the introduction of voter ID shouldn't come as a shock to anyone. The Tories have been promoting the idea for years. In 2016, in response to an extensive review into electoral fraud by Sir Eric Pickles, the government pledged to address numerous issues, including voter impersonation, with the Tory manifesto then promising, "We will protect the integrity of our democracy by introducing identification to vote at polling stations, stopping postal vote harvesting and introducing measures to prevent any foreign interference in elections." Then, once again, it was included in the Conservative manifesto, this time put forward by Boris Johnson. And in 2019, British voters could see these proposals, and if they agreed with them, they could vote Conservative. If they didn't, they could just vote for someone else. But as it turns out, the majority of Brits did indeed agree with what the Conservatives were offering and what they promised to introduce, leading to the biggest win and mandate for the Tories since the 1980s. Voter ID is not only proven to be a success across the world, but was even piloted at local elections in England in 2018 and 2019 to great success. The Electoral Commission's own evaluation of the pilots found that not only did public confidence in the electoral system rise significantly in those areas where voter ID was used compared to the rest of the UK, but despite it being a new rule with problems expected in its early conception, the move did not lead to this mythical voter suppression that left-wingers are banging on about. In fact, voter turnout wasn't really affected at all.
So the report showed that out of nearly 19,000 voters, only 51, that's 0.27% of voters, failed to bring ID or brought the wrong ID when they turned up to vote. The turnout, well, that's pretty much the same as in 2017, so that's a success according to the borough's returning officer.
Out of the constituencies that trialled the scheme, only 0.03% of voters were turned away because they didn't turn up with ID. Yet that tiny number of people could simply just head back home, grab their ID and come back to vote. Simple as that. And of course, this was a new scheme that voters weren't used to. So once voter ID becomes the norm, that number will certainly drop even further. So we know that voter ID doesn't negatively impact voter turnout. But what about the other claim made by the left? That a huge number of people, mainly from the BAME community, don't own any form of ID, and that the cost of buying ID will lead to them not being able to afford to vote in local and general elections, which will in turn constitute voter suppression. Well, when we look at the facts, that claim simply doesn't hold any weight either. The census tells us that approximately 92.5% of electors already have at least one form of acceptable voter ID. Yet that does leave around 3.5 million voters who don't own a driving licence or passport. But dispelling the myth that it's mainly people from the BAME community who don't have ID, the census also shows that in fact it's mainly white and mixed race people affected, with 19% of people in white groups not owning a passport compared to just 7% within the BAME community. Regarding driving licences, data from the DVLA shows that women, people under 20 and over 65, and people living in London are less likely to hold a driving licence, but that this only relates to a tiny percentage of the capital's population. But does this mean that 3.5 million voters who don't have any form of ID will be forced to either spend their cash to buy one or risk being blocked from taking part in our democracy? Is this last remaining argument against voter ID a valid one? Are we really looking at potentially 3.5 million people becoming victims of voter suppression? Well, although the likes of David Lammy and The Guardian would like to make you think so, there is one aspect to this entire news scheme that they are intentionally hiding from you, and it's the one single and simple thing that completely blows apart the false narrative of voter suppression. If you don't have a driving licence or passport, voter ID will be free. That's right, completely free, making sure that every single person in this country who can legally vote will be able to do exactly that, at no cost whatsoever and with absolutely no risk of falling victim to voter suppression. In actual fact, not only will they be able to vote, but they'll now be able to do so in the knowledge that their vote is being protected, that it means something, and that no one else will be able to steal that vote from them at the polling station. As the government confirm in a petition I raised to lobby for voter ID, our democracy is one based on integrity, and the potential for voter fraud in our current electoral system undermines this. At present, you simply need to go to a polling station and say your name and address in order to get your ballot paper, a Victorian system based on trust and the assumption that people know everyone in their communities. They then go on to say that the list of approved photographic ID will not be limited to passports and driving licences. A broad range of commonly held photographic documents will also be accepted. Any voter who does not have one of the other acceptable forms of photographic ID will be able to apply free of charge for a local elector ID from their local authority, ensuring that everyone who is eligible to vote will have the opportunity to do so. And this fact was once again reinforced just yesterday, with a Cabinet Office spokesperson saying, "Showing identification to vote is a reasonable approach to combat the inexcusable potential for voter fraud in our current system and to strengthen its integrity." Evidence shows that voter identification does not impact voter turnout, and it has been operating in Northern Ireland with ease for decades. A broad range of photographic documents will be accepted, not just limited to passports and driver's licences, and will include expired documents. We've also always been clear that a free voter card will be available if needed. So there you have it, folks. There's no voter suppression. No sinister plan by the government, no tricks, no hidden agendas, just the protection of vote integrity, a crucial step towards restoring public trust in the electoral system, and a way of bringing us up to date with the large number of countries across the world who already have voter ID. So please, if there's one thing you do today, help dispel the lies and false narrative being peddled by the left wing, some of which aren't really bothered about the suppression of votes, but are simply bothered about the suppression of their vote riggers. Thanks for watching, and remember, share this video and get the truth out there.